Welcome back to Tiger Conference. Erik Brattberg over here joining me today. Thank you for being with us, and I hope today our audience will learn a lot of new ideas and new strategies, maybe some tactical things, and they will gain some knowledge about transatlantic relationships that you are keen of and aware of, and also an internal American situation, of course, with Donald Trump being a president-elect and probability of change in interpersonal relations between NATO, European Union, United States and NATO, United States and European Union. We have only 20 minutes, so let's go straight to the point. First, Donald Trump. How did it happen, in your opinion, maybe media or social media, that Donald Trump was able to gather the momentum, and he was doing it through the whole election period?
One has to remember, I think, some of the structural issues that are at play. The financial crisis, the slow economic recovery in the United States from the financial crisis in 2008, other problems in the economy, lack of trust in the political system. The approval ratings for Congress is around 10%. So all of these things converge, and Donald Trump was able to tap into, I think, the frustration amongst a lot of regular Americans about the future of the country. And he did it very successfully, on the one hand, blaming different players for being responsible for this, the corrupt politicians, as he calls it.
Crooked Hillary.
Crooked Hillary, drain the swamp in Washington. The Mexicans are stealing our job. The Chinese are stealing our jobs. So he's very clever in kind of pointing the problems in a certain direction. And on the other hand, offering very simple, easy, cookie-cutter solutions. I'm going to make it great. Trust me, we're going to make it great. We're going to have great economic, prospects. Everything is going to be terrific. Just trust in me. So I think this appealed to a lot of people who were dissatisfied with the status quo, who wanted to see change. And Donald Trump represented change, and someone like Hillary Clinton did not represent change. She represented, let's continue the same old
establishment.
The establishment that is not working. So I think this in a large part explains why someone like Donald Trump was able to emerge. And finally, his ability to use media, to use social media very actively, to be all over cable news constantly, talking, making people excited. Even people that don't like Donald Trump can help to watch it, because you don't know what he's going to say.
That's true.
It's unconventional. And he was able to get a lot of publicity for free without spending any money, running an unconventional campaign, utilizing media as a platform for doing so.
So there was a demand for the show like he pulled, right? Demand from the audience, from Americans. They wanted this show to happen, and they wanted to hear what they heard from Donald Trump. Okay, then. I can agree with what you're saying, of course. That this has been on air in recent weeks. People were discussing how did it happen so. Let's see what's going to happen further. I think this is the most unpredictable system right now, because we don't know what to expect for Donald Trump from his staff. We don't know what everyone from his staff. We don't know the whole list yet. We don't know how he's going to end up relationships or not with NATO or European Union, how he's going to reset or not reset relations with Vladimir Putin. But anyway, let's try and not guess, but let's try and predict from your perspective. How do you think relations with European countries and European Union will change for the United States?
It's interesting that the first foreign leader to meet Donald Trump after he was elected was Nigel Farage, the UKIP leader and the pro-Brexit campaigner from the UK. Is this symbolic about how Donald Trump views the EU? Certainly on the campaign trail, Donald Trump said some very negative things about the EU. He said negative things about Angela Merkel. He criticized the EU's immigration policy. There's a question here whether Donald Trump will align himself more with some of these populist politicians in Europe, not just Nigel Farage and UKIP in the UK, but also potentially Le Pen in France and other politicians across Europe. And if that were to be the case, that would be unprecedented. That would be a major shift in US policy towards Europe. That would reverse decades of traditional US support for the European project and European integration.
If that happens, what's going to happen then with the European Union if what you just mentioned, let's assume it happens?
I think it could create real problems, because traditionally America has played a supportive role in promoting the European Union as an idea and promoting European integration in support of the European project. So if America take a step back, and becomes less supportive or even becomes disruptive, that could really change things. You could see America not being involved in the Brexit campaign,
right.
The Brexit debate. You could see America no longer promoting free trade with Europe. You could see America under Trump potentially providing support and aligning itself with some of these far-right populists, being critical of the way that Germany is addressing things like immigration or the euro crisis. So potentially it could cause a disruptive effect that could have a bigger impact on weakening the European Union as such at a time when we need a stronger and more able European Union to address the multitude of challenges and crises that we're facing. That's a very dangerous prospect.
What are these challenges and what are these threats that the European Union has now?
I think there are threats both internally within the European Union.
Right.
Brexit is one of them. How the EU will manage its future relationship with Great Britain. Immigration policy is a big one. Again, the rise of far-right politicians and Eurosceptic political parties across Europe. The unsolved Greek debt crisis and the euro crisis. So these are many potential issues that are within Europe. Then you have issues outside of Europe. Security issues. You have the situation in Ukraine, you have the relationship with Russia that is using various ways of undermining European unity, propaganda, disinformation, military provocations. You have instability in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, which is causing these massive refugee flows that we saw last year and that is exporting terrorism and sort of radical jihadism to Europe. So these are all problems that are coming at Europe, both from within and from the outside, where we need not just a united Europe to deal with this collectively, but also a supporting role from the United States. And if we don't have that, we're going to have a much harder time addressing these in many ways, existential crises that we're facing at the moment.
So you think we can change to an unbearable state, I would say, if in 2017 populism will prevail, and it seems that it will prevail in 2017 in European states, and let's assume Donald Trump's populism, his populism will find a way to work out in the United States if checks and balances won't work. So we're going to have a world full of populism, Western civilization and Eastern civilization, meaning, for example, Russia, let's say, right? Then what's going to happen if it all works out in a bad way for us? Are we going to have a disintegration of the European Union, for example? We're going to have a Russia marching through European countries, promoting Russia's military stance and possibilities. Russia's taking over whole Ukraine, for example. Do you see that possible, or this is just...
So the American journalist Anne Applebaum, she wrote an article back in March, and she said that we're only a few elections away from the end of the West as we know it. Well, since then, we've had the Brexit vote, we've had the Trump getting elected, and we could potentially see, for instance, a President Le Pen in France or other far-right leaders in other European countries. So perhaps we're on track towards something that could become what you're describing. That would be a nightmare scenario.
Absolutely.
The disintegration of the European project and the disappearance of America as this traditional leader of the free world. That would have huge ramifications for everything that we take for granted, from politics to economy to our societies. Now, with regards to Russia, this is obviously something that Russia would like to see, that Putin would like to see, that the West would crumble from within, would get divided between countries within the West, so that Russia would be able to have an influence. I don't think anyone believes that Russia is militarily going to march in and take over countries in Europe. That's not what it's about. But Russia they want to undermine the West, they want to reassert its own sphere of influence, particularly in the former Soviet sphere, which includes Ukraine.
Of course.
And they stand for a different model, the Putin model of state capitalism, corruption, and military aggression. And so this is the model that we could see could become even more common if we ourselves, the West, fails to stay united and stay focused on addressing the challenges that we face. This could embolden Putin to become even more aggressive, if you will, at home and abroad.
Thank you for that. And let's go on to China then. We don't usually speak about China here in Ukraine, and even in recent news from the US or from European outlets, I haven't heard much about China. Everyone is more concerned about European elections and Donald Trump. So let's speak about China. I can assume that if things that we were talking about are going to happen, or at least 20% of that is going to happen, let's say 20% of populism will rise in Europe and in the United States. What China is going to have from this, what China is going to achieve from this, do you see they're going to benefit from it somehow on the way to world leadership?
I think China is, on the one hand, I think China is the long-term strategic challenge for the West and for the United States in particular. It's the only country that will in the future have the ability to challenge the United States' role in the world. Russia is a declining power that is using its declining power in very strategic ways and oftentimes very effectively. But China is a different ballgame in terms of the size of its economy, its military, and potentially its political influence. At the same time, China does not necessarily seek to undermine the current international system. They actually benefit from it and they are dependent on it. So I think China views Trump and the potential for more populists in Europe with a great deal of skepticism and perhaps even fear that the system that they depend on will no longer be taken for granted. That would impact their own economy, which in turn provides stability for the communist regime in Beijing. So unlike Russia, which would love to upend the current system and replace it with this new kind of multipolar sphere of influence kind of system, China would like to play somewhat within the current structure, but they want a greater voice and greater influence. And you also have to remember that the US has a very difficult situation with China, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, where China is rising as a major power. We're seeing this being played out in the South China Sea, where China is exerting itself, they're establishing a sphere of influence, they're pushing the US out. How the US will respond to this will be critical for security, not just in the Asia-Pacific, but it will have global ramifications as well.
Thank you for explaining that. I think this is super important not to forget about major player in the world, which is China. And a couple of more questions probably on those regions that we haven't mentioned before. So Japan, we haven't mentioned that. Japan, South Korea, North Korea. Do you see any change of interpersonal relationship between the United States now with the new president-elect, well, probably with the president soon, and these countries that I've mentioned?
These are countries that were very worried about the prospect of a Trump presidency, especially because Trump very much criticized countries like Japan for not contributing enough to their own security.
Abe was the first one to came.
Yet Abe was the first foreign leader to meet with Trump and apparently had a very successful meeting and apparently left that meeting feeling more assured about US commitment. South Korea may feel similarly. So in some ways, these countries could eventually view a Trump administration and a Republican administration as perhaps serving their needs more. If Trump were to take a tougher stand against China, for instance, that would be a good thing for Japan. So I think we'll see how this is going to play out.
Still unpredictable, of course.
Still very unpredictable at the moment.
Well, in the end, as we are in Ukraine, definitely we have to finalize it here about Ukraine. I know that your knowledge about Ukraine is somehow limited at some point. I hope it, no disrespect in here. But anyway, you're probably familiar with people who are getting on the list of staff of President-elect Donald Trump, and some of them are either familiar with the Ukrainian issue or Ukraine, and others are familiar with Russia and Russian issue, like friendly to Russia and towards Russia. So my question would be, how do you expect our relationship would change, or at least do you see a direction where our relationship are going?
I think it's fair to say that certainly there are people in the Trump circle that have personal political ties and commercial ties to Russia, and also to Ukraine, but not necessarily to the image of Ukraine that the government would like to represent, but to the former Yanukovych regime, like Paul Manafort, for instance. So these are people that exist in the Trump universe and that will have the president's ear. Whether he will listen to them and influence his decisions, we don't know yet. Trump will also appoint other cabinet level positions, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. These people will also be important in influencing the US policy towards Ukraine and towards Russia. I think what we could likely see is, at least initially, maybe a little bit more reluctance, maybe not as strong encouragement necessarily. I think it would be a big step even for a Trump administration to roll back the sanctions and to, as some people speculate, recognize Crimea. That would be a really, really significant and, in my view, very unfortunate development. I think that's still unrealistic at this point, but we have to watch it very closely. And it's important to keep in mind that besides the president and his advisors, you also have the role of the US Congress. And Congress is very supportive of Ukraine and US support to Ukraine. And they are not going to let President Donald Trump change that policy if he wants to without a fight. So I think we're going to have to watch all of these things as they play out. Potentially a little bit more reluctant role initially, but hopefully we will see the US support for Ukraine continue.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Erik Brattberg was my guest here today.
Thank you very much.